So without further ado, I'd like to introduce our keynote speaker. Umur Cubukcu is the former co-founder and CEO of Citus Data, now the head of the Postgres PM team at Microsoft since the acquisition back in 2019. He'll be talking about 8 keys to the growth of Citus and distributed Postgres. Hello, Umur.
Hey, Aaron.
Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
I look forward to hearing more about your talk. So,
happy to dive in. Thank you, Aaron. All right. So it's great to be here, and today I do want to talk about the 8 key drivers of the growth of Citus and distributed Postgres, and along the way, the lessons that we learned, which hopefully can be useful more broadly, and also inform what we do, going forward. So going back when we first founded Citus around, that was 2011, we did it with a goal of changing what's possible with Postgres. And what prompted that was really the explosion of data. And the term big data was coined around that time, maybe a bit later. But really, it's the volume of data, it's the type of data, and the growth of it being so much more than what Silicon could catch up with, made it abundantly clear to us that, hey, distributed systems are the way to go. And with the advent of the cloud and with all the things that come with it, said, hey, can we make something we know and we're familiar with, which is Postgres? Can we make that distributed instead of starting everything from scratch? And in fact, that's what we did. So with Citus, essentially, it is Postgres extended with the power of distributed tables, right? It is fully open source, so you can download it and use it, or it's also available as a fully managed service on Azure as a hyperscale Citus. And here our logo, the elephant with the kind of the magical unicorn, is it's kind of a throwback to Postgres' elephant and our kind of attempt at making it more magical through this distributed and horizontally scalable behavior, really. And with Citus, what you can do is, and what you are doing today is, instead of scaling up with a traditional, relational database, or what you would do with Postgres, you're able to, in addition to scaling up, really scale out. So really change that dynamic and have a slider, take it whether you have a couple of Postgres nodes or 20 of them or 100 of them, and really, without having to kind of entirely change how your architecture, how your application behaves, you kind of put that complexity to where it belongs, which is in the database layer, and worry about your application and have us worry about the complexities of running a distributed, transactional relational database. So and with that, today Citus powers a lot of the Fortune 500 in key workloads, a lot of governments, most of it in the Americas, but also in Europe and some in Asia as well. And lots of startups who kind of build, especially kind of SaaS applications using Citus and Postgres. On the open source side, we get more than 1 million downloads every year, and that number keeps growing. So there's a very large footprint of users today. So coming back to the essence of the talk, I want to dive into what's kind of making this possible. And the first, perhaps most obvious, is Postgres, right? It's betting on Postgres and building on Postgres. And that choice, as obvious as it might be right now, wasn't as much kind of back then versus, the NoSQL. Again, going back to 2010, 2011, the zeitgeist was one of very much of Hadoop, of NoSQL, and saying, hey, SQL won't scale. And therefore, you're building the wrong thing. That was the earliest feedback that we had. And of course, over time, the pendulum has really kind of swung our way. And then versus something like MySQL, the popularity was very different. I mean, and maybe an order of magnitude difference, as much as kind of Postgres had its strengths. Now, there is really key drivers as to why we made this choice. One is the really extensibility of Postgres, which is one of the most important characteristics of Postgres, which I'll talk a bit more into in later slides. But it's also the fact that its code base, its documentation is very clean relatively, especially to kind of to other things, and it has this kind of built by developers for developers, sense to it. And finally, a license. As we're building an offering and a kind of a commercial offering around it, the flexibility of the Postgres license also obviously played into that factor. And fast forward to today, and we couldn't have been happier with that choice. This is a kind of a chart from DB Engines that looks at the relative popularity, and it's on a logarithmic scale. So, going back about 10 years ago, you see Postgres almost at 1/10 of where MySQL, SQL Server, and Oracle is, and today that picture has entirely changed, and it will continue to change. And we of course are biggest fans of Postgres. Then, though, it's not just betting on Postgres; it's how we approach building a distributed database. And prior to Citus, there were really two ways if you wanted to do that. One is you would fork from an existing project. In this case, it could be Postgres or it could be MySQL, and that's what a lot of the what's called the MPP databases or massively parallel, like analytics databases did. Think Greenplum, think Redshift, and Netezas of the world. Or you had Postgres XC, as a project, or on the MySQL side, you would have something like Galera Cluster. All of these are basically looking at distributed systems in different angles, different workloads, but really forking the original database. And of course, when you do fork, it's, you over time, especially, you're on a kind of divergent path, and it really, both not just from features, but from testability requirements, it becomes a different beast. The other approach is, of course, to say, hey, there are new requirements, so I'm going to build something from scratch, right? And that's what, the NoSQL movement did. That's what, Hadoop did, and a lot of the newer generation of databases kind of still do. And back then we said, hey, is there a third way to do this? And what made that possible, that extending what already exists, was what Postgres did, really, with especially after 9.0, and the 9.1 came out, I believe, in 2011, with some very low-level APIs that allow you to extend any part of the database. So that could be the plan, the query planning, execution, data types, anything you could hook into pre or post. And that's a little too detailed for at the application level, but for building a database, it's actually fascinatingly useful. So we took advantage, of those, and when we announced, that we unforked from Postgres, that really resonated with our audience, with the developers, and people who really used our product. That was back in around 2016. But it's not just technically interesting; it enables us to do all these things. The most recent of which is, several months ago in 2021, we were able to release the latest version of Postgres, which is PG14, that came out, in the fall, literally a day after it was released, make it available on our service on Azure. And those are things that we're able to do through unforking from Postgres. And as many wonderful things as Postgres has done over the past 20 plus years, it is going to do that many more, in the next decades to come. And we want to make sure that our users and we benefit from kind of that core, core body of work. And that's why we care so much about it, and our customers care about it. And we're, happy to see some other companies, follow a similar approach. Now, third is going open source. And this, again, is kind of obvious in hindsight, but it kind of went together with the primary goal of this is really, especially when we're talking about a transactional database, to develop trust, right, and to leverage what's already been built, like with the community, with the tooling, all of that. And right now, of course, Citus, you can find the repo on GitHub. This aka.ms/Citus link takes you directly to there, but it really kind of gives the benefits of an open source project. Now, since we're right now, at least in the APAC region, I just kind of went before the talk to some of the initial reactions we got at the time. And these are just some of the few of them. We had, after going open source, a community site pop up in China that talks about what Citus is and what it does. We had an enterprise users at kind of HP Enterprise take our documentation, translate it into Japanese, and then make it available for enterprise users. We had startups like Smart HR in this case give a talk about how they used Citus kind of at conferences there in Japan. All of it happening organically without us really kind of driving those conversations, and that really is the beauty of open source from a community perspective. The other side of it for us is giving back. It's not just through a contribution of code, but we did something which we cared a lot about, and that is to give a percentage of the company, the Citus data as a company back then, to donate that into the Postgres foundations worldwide, which then translates so that our success or our outcome, if you will, is directly reflects on Postgres, whose shoulders we really stand on. And that, of course, paid off following the Microsoft acquisition. The fourth piece is, and this goes hand in hand with making Citus open source, is offering it as a service in the cloud. This goes to all the fully managed database experiences that you come to expect, from provisioning to management, a lot of the the patching, the security, and all of those things that are taken care of automatically. There's clear, of course, customer value to it. There's also commercial value for as to make this sustainable. When we make things open source, then this becomes the primary driver of of monetized product. And so this a big shout out to the our part of the team that joined us from Heroku back then, who had built a similar service, and then kind of made that happen within Citus. Number 5 is really focusing on specific workloads, and I do want to dissect this just a little bit. When we talk about product market fit, back then and even still today, there's an explosion all of a sudden of different database, solutions and providers. And this is a report that was published, back in 2016 by, for 51 Research. This is just the cover page, but it's every dot there is a like a subway train station, let's say, and every dot is a company, and each station is, each line is type of a workload or an approach. But the main idea is there are so many dots, so many stops, so many companies, and each of how do you navigate this? And more importantly for us, how do we get noticed, right? And then considering, now with Microsoft things, of course, it's different, but especially early on. And the wedge, again, we used was Postgres. And we said, hey, if you want to scale Postgres, then we're the right solution. And what that did is it, made it clear, hey, if you did not resonate with that message, then we would disqualify you. And likewise, we would, have that conversation and progress things otherwise. But we, when I think about product market fit, essentially that to dissect that into 2 pieces almost. There's what you say, which is the message market fit, and there is how your product fits to that, which is the product message fit. So all of it combined is what gets you product market fit. And on the message market fit, we found a niche or a wedge, if you will, around Postgres and around scalable Postgres, really. And then the question is, okay, in terms of meeting that message, for what workloads, can we scale, Postgres? Because one of the things that makes Postgres so compelling is it's a very diverse, versatile tool that you can kind of tackle like a lot of things with it. And that really took us to like particular workloads, which we got, really sharp on, and then communicated, and over time built, and expanded on. So the first of those workloads has been focusing on like operational or in-app analytics. Sometimes it's referred to as like HTAP, hybrid transactions analytics combined. And I like to think of it as analyze your writes. So when you write something to the database, that often comes in a few flavors, but one is it's a system of record application, but it requires some on-demand analytics. And you don't have the luxury of moving that data out to a data warehouse and then doing things offline on it. You want it right there, right then. Or it's maybe not a system of record, but it requires fast analytics on your maybe like engagement with customers, with devices and other things. But it requires high concurrency. Again, it's not something that a data warehouse can handle by way of its concurrency. And finally, workloads that leverage the advantages of Postgres, such as JSON-B, such a powerful capability within Postgres. Being able to kind of run analytics on that data together with transactions is very compelling, as is geospatial, which is through the PostGIS extension makes Postgres so unique. So leveraging those was our first wedge, together with multi-tenant applications. And especially we found, early on that SaaS companies, of which there is many and increasingly more, of course, have a very natural way to distribute their data, which is by tenant. You want, often when you're building a SaaS application, all your data for a particular tenant to reside together. So that provides a natural distribution key. And by leveraging that directly in the database, we would then provide powerful capabilities like being able to share data across tenants, query across tenants, or isolate a particular tenant and really abstract that sharding and manual sharding and all that burden away from the application and have this appear and behave as a single Postgres. And that became very popular. And then, of course, as we solved these challenges one by one, you had to, make distributed transactions work. So when you have your data distributed across multiple machines and you're writing to one, committing to another, and then things fail, how do you roll back? How do you ensure that all of this appears and behaves as a single Postgres would? That's what we refer to with distributed transactions. And for more, and there's a lot more than the time we have here to talk through, but there's a SIGMOD paper, the SIGMOD conference last year. We published a paper, and Marco from our team has been really instrumental in driving that. So encourage you to take a look at that. 6 is delighting customers. No product is useful and really existent without customers. And for us, users are our open source users who just use it like as is, and customers are those who kind of engage with us on a commercial basis. But doesn't matter from a they need to be engaged and be happy. And that's the first getting to wow point as quickly as we can. Another is not being distracted by, because we established a Postgres wedge, we would often be approached by companies who wanted just Postgres expertise, consulting and other gigs, and some very big names that you'd be compelled to talk to. And we always did talk, but we never engaged if it didn't take us into a scalable path. And that we did across hundreds of conversations. 500 plus is probably an underestimate, maybe not as many as 1,000, but way up there is where we talk with customers to find out these patterns that I talked about kind of earlier. Another important thing that helped was our engineers. We didn't have a separate support team. Our engineers carried the pager. So that meant, when something went wrong, they'd have the incentive and the know-how to fix that. And finally, taking a long-term view meant, we'd have customers, for example, who would come 5 years, and I'm not exaggerating. I remember one who came a year after we launched. They heard about us, and we were just too early for what they wanted to accomplish. And then 5 years later, they came back and they used our product. So, but when you are kind of building and things compound in a very delightful way. 7, this cuts across everything we do, which is our team. And I can't, of course, emphasize the importance of it and how much, pride and happiness it gives me personally, to work with such a group. As distributed as our database is, as is our team. So we have folks anywhere from here, where I am in San Francisco, to Istanbul and Ankara in Turkey, to Amsterdam, to Redmond, to New Zealand, and Paris and elsewhere. So we are a distributed team, and being able to kind of work together drives our product forward. And last, absolutely not least, number 8, is Microsoft continued support. So we took that wedge, and we made sure that there is a lot of interest and growth in what we're building. And Microsoft, following the acquisition, now we are 3 years into it, has kept investing in it. So this event, very event that we're talking at Citus Con, is an example of it. The number of downloads of Citus is at an all-time high. Just in February, we checked the numbers; they were up more than 200%, or 2x, I should say. And so all up, we're looking this year to exceed more than 3 million, installs. So open source growing strong, and very importantly, our core committers to the Postgres project. We have more within Microsoft people who contribute to the upstream project than any other major cloud provider. In fact, all of them combined, we have more contributions to the Postgres upstream project. And that one of the earlier topics I talked about, which is the making Citus into an extension, as an example, when we introduced a third way to build a distributed databases, that was made possible with a big shout out to Andres Freund, who really made that possible for us and for our customers. All right. So that's those things combined, not any one of them just by themselves, but combined have kind of taken us to where we are. Looking ahead, we find ourselves in a very compelling place with Citus and Distributed Postgres. There's three areas where continued investments will happen. One is just the open source distributed engine, which is Citus, and Citus 11 is just come out in beta. The actual release will be in shortly, and Marco has a talk on that. Please take a look if you're interested. The other aspect of it is open source Postgres, which I was talking to earlier. Postgres 15 is landing in fall as usual with a host of wonderful features, and there's quite a few that our team has been driving. I believe Thomas Monroe is talking right after, and then we'll touch on some of those. And third is, of course, our PaaS offering on Azure. And that we always keep up to date. The Postgres 14, the day after it came, we released. Same thing will happen with PG 15 and then beyond. And we also, want to make it more and more accessible to just running Postgres at any scale. And today, you can run our offering hyperscale Citus on Azure with just a single node. So you don't have to worry about distributing and sharding and etc. You can just run as is on a regular Postgres and then define your distribution as you move along. But we want to take that even further and make it kind of simpler to do. And of course, the open source version you can use with a single command, whether Docker or otherwise. All of that then takes us to the broader picture, which is our journey of taking the relational and the non-relational, the NoSQL sides together through the power of distributed Postgres. Continuous has been kind of as exciting as ever. So that entails the horizontal scalability and the global data distribution that the Citus and our Azure offerings bring together. It entails the structured and JSON data together, which Postgres does wonderfully with JSONB, and it entails preserving the relational semantics for your application. And Azure with Postgres, with Citus, and with the other offerings it has with Azure Postgres, Azure Cosmos DB is an excellent place to take advantage all of those and bring those as delightful products to you both in the open, as I was alluding to in the earlier slide, and as a managed service. I think that wraps up the slides that I had. Hopefully, I hit it on time.
Thank you very much, Umur. That was fascinating, and it's quite amazing to see the journey that Citus has had since joining Microsoft in particular. I remember when it was, you joined us in 2019, and I caught up very rapidly with Citus just at PyCon, actually, was when I first really started diving deep, first conference with Microsoft. I have a question for you.
Sure.
What are some of the aspects of the Postgres open source community that have really helped Citus be as successful as it is?
That's an excellent question. I think I'll enumerate a few. The Postgres community is very welcoming. And that might not come across depending on what angle. Sometimes when you're submitting a patch, you might find things are kind of clunky, etc. But overall, there is no preferential treatment, if you will. So if you are kind of putting things forward, people will listen to you, people will kind of interact with you. So that's been super helpful. It's also not centralized and run by any particular company. So Postgres by design is decentralized, and then like one of the core committers, which of that group, Andres again was at Citus Data before, now at Microsoft. So we have a say, but we don't, and nobody does kind of like steer, which I find very helpful. And the last thing, I mean, there's so many things, but that pops into my mind is the whole ecosystem of the tooling, because the database is so much more than just the bits and bytes that store your and kind of secure and ship your data. It's the language bindings. It's like the shell you connect with. It's the how you do the monitoring, and all of those things are part of that open source community, and they are that makes the picture whole, which has been tremendously helpful for us.
Yes, what struck me is how composable things in the Postgres ecosystem are, and you can reach out, and you've got this fantastic extensions mechanism, which really gives us huge advantage.
It does. And as a database, the extensibility is of all the kind of features it has. I'd put that as almost like I'd call that out separately, because it's a meta feature that Postgres has that no other database has to that level of detail, which makes Citus possible, which makes like other databases and other solutions possible. So it's fascinating.
And would you say there are ways that obviously the joining Microsoft and Microsoft's involvement in the Postgres community has accelerated the upstream development within Postgres as a whole? Would that be correct?
That would be correct, and I mean that takes time to materialize, and it has. I mean, we've been growing kind of our Postgres like committing team steadily since the acquisition. And adding, like new folks as well. And it's not just the upstream Postgres project, it's also a host of extensions. Citus itself is an extension, but then we maintain a host of others, like, for example, pgcron, or, like HLL, the Hyperlog log extension, or Topan, or a host of other things which our team, builds and maintains for, for the community. And that has, like, the aggregate output of it comfortably has sped up. That's for sure.
And would you give any advice to people who want to work on Citus in the open source, particularly if they're at a tech company or considering joining a tech company to work on open source Postgres?
I'd say a few things. There is different levels of contributing to Postgres, right? And then it doesn't have to be at the highest bar, and that of course takes time to build up to it. Postgres is famous for its documentation, for example. It's very kind of like well written, and so there is anything from there to filing bugs could be contributions, holding events. It doesn't have to be code. Like just being a outspoken supporter of Postgres is a contribution in of itself. Those are things on the open source side, and then separate from that, just being curious. I find that that holds for everything we do. I think, in fact, when I was talking about the team slide, that's one of the key characteristics that we look for when we're hiring, and that fitted very nicely with the Microsoft value of the growth mindset. Right. Yes. So when we we were very happy at the time of the acquisition to see there's just a direct, marrying, if you will, of some of those values. And I find that extremely helpful. If you're curious with that growth mindset, how can I make this better? Your application, your database, and Postgres is, again, is a long-standing project that will, if you put the energy into it, it'll pay back.
Yes, and you spoke about the community being welcoming. It strikes me there are so many routes to becoming involved from an open source perspective. You mentioned things like documentation and community involvement and all of these other things. It seems like a fantastic.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, other Python is an excellent example. Like, it doesn't have to be the Postgres core. Like Django is a framework that's very popular with Python, and it almost defaults to Postgres as an underlying database. And there's things you can do there. It could be at the app layer. It's just piecing together and/or contributing to different pieces. Postgres is such a kind of capable database, and then once we kind of extend it, like its Achilles heel has been, hey, but it doesn't scale, but it's not cloud ready. Like I'm going to choke if I upgrade my Postgres. It's going to become this monolith, which I'm not going to be able to, not just performance, but backing up is more difficult, vacuuming is more difficult, indexing is more difficult. So it just becomes more fragile. We take that problem away and you say, hey, you know what? You can scale up if you want, but now it gives you this elastic kind of horizontal scalability with the goodness of Postgres. We think that's a very exciting combination, and I'm happy to see it resonate in the market.
I've seen this huge affinity that the Python community has for Postgres as well, and it extends to others like in the cloud native community. Postgres is the favorite database of so many people.
Yeah.
Are there any other communities that that immediately come to mind that you find Postgres in particular has the affinity for, like Python?
I mean, you mentioned cloud native. I would dare say, I don't have necessarily a number to back it up, but just intuition-wise, AKS, like the Azure, Kubernetes service, or more broadly, Kubernetes. If you're building kind of on top and using a, database, Postgres, chances are, is your go-to database. Again,
yes.
There is MySQL, which is also like very popular. So I can't tell, hey, definitively Postgres, but there's clearly a strong kind of association there. There is also kind of interesting areas on the Microsoft side with like Visual Studio and others that are, traditionally been more with, of course, .NET and other frameworks, and then are making now life easier for working with Postgres, with Azure Data Studio and other things, which is also, I think that's a strength that is on the Microsoft side that is kind of expanding over time into Postgres. Again, in an open source fashion.
Yeah,
exactly.
Well, thank you very much, Umur. It's been great to have you here.
Hey, absolutely. Thank you, Aaron. And yeah, thanks for everyone who's joining us. It's been my pleasure.